Hello, let's have a look and see what today's archetype is. Have a look at today's archetype is water and air, which is an archetype which used to be called the child. Some people have called it the angel recently. I've tended to call it the nymph, so that's the next one that we'll be having a look at. Now, the nymph or child archetype, as it was originally called, is an archetype which has water as its predominant element, and its inner element is air. It's an archetype which is characterized by great sensitivity and receptivity and openness. It's a consciousness in which I think there is often not a great deal of a sense of self, really. It's rather self-forgetting in a sense, and it is simply taken up with the vision that it's presented with, and it is an archetype of great vision. It's an archetype and a state of consciousness which is very much associated with imagination, inspiration, innocence, surrender. Its sensitivity is akin to a photographic plate in a sense. It registers impressions, and it registers them in a way which is quite overwhelming for it at times. There is a newness to this consciousness, a freshness, an openness, as I said. And in this state, a person can pick up tremendous details and depths of meaning from things just from their presence, or just from those impressions hitting them. So something which for another person would be, well, just a surface thing, for somebody that's in this state, an experience can give them all sorts of content which might not be accessible to another person. But this state is so sensitive and so receptive that it really can absorb all of this stuff and feel very, very deeply the actual meaning of things. So that's one thing about this archetype. It was originally called the child archetype. I've called it the nymph archetype because in part I wanted a way to kind of show that this actually is an archetype which can grow up, if you see what I mean. It's not an easy archetype to live with as an adult, and especially men in our culture tend to be punished for having this archetype. It's looking after itself is not its forte, if you see what I mean. It's so unself-conscious in that way. But its openness means it's really open to inspiration, and it's open to sort of like direct communication from spirits, from the other world. It has a directness and an authenticity to it. It has a genuineness to it, which in general, if people aren't ill disposed towards it, they tend to respond to. So often unless there are things mitigating against it, people coming across this state will tend to cut it some slack, because they can see that this state is effectively harmless in most of the ways that we think of the outer world. And it is largely it's not a state which self-protects. That's the thing. It's not aware of that, and there's a lot of things that it's not aware of, but it's tremendously imaginative, open to inspiration, and it can be it certainly can be a very loving state as well, if in the right circumstances. Now, to look at its negative sides, this is a side which, this is a state which is obviously, it's very vulnerable, and so it's open to being hurt and to being damaged in a sense, and then it will withdraw and close up. And it can then have to find, in a kind of panic, ways of coping with the world, and so it will get shut up inside and find false ways to actually behave. The person who is actually in this state will get that, and may fall into that, so they will have to become very mental, or they will become kind of passive aggressive or something like that. One of the problems with it, it can become sort of self-victimizing, it can become whiny, it can become highly needy, and all these sorts of things, and it can descend into kind of hysterics, really, which is all very understandable, really, but these are obviously negative manifestations, and it needs to find the ways to be able to survive in the world and to function in the world. But truthfully, it needs to also be given a place, and it's something that needs to be recognized when it's there and valued, and it very much needs to be valued. So those are some of the things about the manifestations and qualities of this state. It does bring a kind of blessing presence with it, though, when it's flowing properly. It brings a kind of freshness and a beauty and an appreciation of beauty with it, and there's a gentleness to it which is really a valuable quality. We see it in various kinds of places, I do see it in some of the nature spirits and things like this, which is partly why I refer to it as a nymph. And I think nymph also gives it some of the other qualities to it. It hints at what it can become as well when it has a place, I think, rather than just the sort of child or what have you. It has an appreciation of spiritual power. It sees spiritual power very directly, so it appreciates it. Obviously, you see it in figures that seem almost like I kind of recoil from using the word fairy, because fairies are the fae, and the fairies are an entire people in mythology, and they are not the cute little winged creatures of Victorian imagination. The nymph archetype, though, has a little bit more of that sense of the Victorian sense of it, but I actually think that it contains within it something which is closer to the actual pagan sense of the fae. It has some of that to it. There's an otherworldliness to it. And so it has that quality of being between worlds. In Christian mythology, in sort of like Christian mythology, it seems to be associated to an extent with various sort of like various sort of like visions of the Virgin Mary as a kind of like as a youthful blessing figure or what have you. That's within Christian mythology. But I would stick with the nymphs and the fairies and the fae, actually, for where this figure is. So we will see her in these elusive entities and their manifestations. That's about as much as I could say about this archetype for now. So I hope that gives a little bit to go on. It is a very valuable archetype, and one which tends to suffer a great deal in the sort of lives that people are forced into living. She does need a place made for her so that she can actually survive. She needs that, and we would do well to actually make more places for this archetype and this consciousness to be able to be fostered in our lives and our societies, because it's one of the archetypes which brings a very healing quality with it, and it actually really benefits us to allow its presence. And so I will just leave this video there for now.